Today in America, if a city block burns to the ground, it'll make headlines nationwide. Back in 1904 in Baltimore, 70 city blocks burned to the ground. These buildings were located in an area over 140 acres, consisted of over 1,500 buildings, housing more than 2,500 businesses, and overnight throwing over 35,000 workers out of a job. I'm Pete Peterson, Professor of Management at Johns Hopkins University and author of the book, The Great Baltimore Fire. We're standing in front of the first Mariner Arena. However, 100 years ago, this was the location of the John E. Hurst Building where the Great Baltimore Fire started. The fire started in the basement of the John E. Hurst Building, and some buildings had night watchmen. This particular building did not. And in the after-action report of the Great Baltimore Fire, the fire chief, Chief Horton, stated that had there been a night watch in the building behind me, the records would have reflected small fire in the basement, quickly extinguished, and that would have been it. But that was not the case. Across the street, however, in the National Exchange Bank, there was a night watchman. His name was John Coughlin, and he was sort of goofing off. He was sitting in the window, a barred window, and he was looking across the street, watching the fire in the Hearst Building. He thought he was safe, and he was perched there just enjoying himself, and lo and behold, at the time of the smoke explosion, John Coughlin was blown out of the window. His clothes caught on fire, and he quickly got up and rushed out of the building and headed towards Baltimore Street. Unfortunately, he collapsed just as he reached Baltimore Street and then woke up in the hospital. Ironically, across the street, looking towards the west, there was a wooden saloon untouched. And so, while the fire burned out of control for 30 hours, it had a will of its own, and the wind took it where it was going to go. And apparently, the wind didn't take it across the street. Although the Great Baltimore Fire did burn the entire downtown portion of Baltimore in 1904, it didn't move as fast as many people thought. But indeed, it did move. And to give you some idea, from roughly 11 o'clock from where I'm standing until about supper time, say 6 o'clock, It moved 3.5 blocks to the north and about 3.5 blocks to the east and about 2.5 blocks to the south and also further to the east. It seems like we're in the middle of traffic noises in downtown Baltimore. So please bear with the noises, and the story continues. Behind the building, constructed in 1896, survived the fire. As the fire moved along with the wind, and indeed the wind had a will of its own, it advanced to the north and then moved to the east, now moving on Fayette Street in the direction that I'm pointing. And we will follow this fire and watch how it progresses. We're now standing at the corner of Charles and Fayette Street. Years ago, 1904, this was the location of Johnny Putz's department store, known as the Glass Palace. Ironically, today, it's the location of a building that is known as the Lamp of Learning, particularly at night, when it's all lit up and you can see light coming out of all of the windows. Here at Putz's department store, he stood in the doorway, and as he heard the dynamite explosions going off and moving closer and closer towards his store, he was finally approached by the men who stated, "We're here to blow up your store." And he said, "Well, I'm covered with fire insurance, but I don't know about dynamite. Who's going to pay for that?" And they argued away, and nothing was done. And then finally the building caught fire. And lo and behold, at that time, Putz agreed. Go ahead and dynamite the building. Well, unfortunately, the dynamite blowing holes in the ground, smashing all the windows, and shooting firebrands across the street managed to set the Union Trust building ablaze. The tall building behind me, the Union Trust building, burned during the Great Baltimore Fire of 1904. It was totally gutted and rebuilt, and here in a new century, that building survives. That building was described as a skyscraper in the New York Times on Monday morning, the 8th of February. So you can see what a skyscraper looked like in the minds of people in 1904. As we move to the north, the next building in line is Thomas O'Neill's department store. Indeed, the most elegant store this side of Wanamaker's in Philadelphia. Thomas O'Neill was a burly Irishman with a walrus mustache who didn't take any nonsense from anyone. And so as the dynamite men approached, he stood in his doorway and stood his ground, refused to let the dynamite men blow up his store. Actually, he stated, and it's a clear quote from yesteryear, "If you blow up this store, you'll blow me up with it."
And there it was, up on top of that O'Neill building that I had. It was the great 15,000-gallon water tank that was later broken into to flood the roof. They stuffed the downspouts so the roof would flood to catch the firebrands as they came over. There are two of my men on the roof that very day saving the building. The firebrands would come over and they'd go over and squash them, as well as the sprinkler system down the side of the building. 83 windows were each covered by downspouts that came out and douse the fire.
The Fidelity building, the tall one behind me, is at the edge of the fire district of the Great Baltimore Fire. We're at the corner, or looking at the corner, of Lexington and Charles Street. At the time of the fire, in 1904, Governor Edwin Warfield was also the president of Fidelity. We couldn't imagine that today, where a governor would also be the president of a financial organization doing business with the state of Maryland. But nevertheless, times certainly have changed. This building was only 6 stories tall at the time of the fire, and there is a rim above the 6th floor where from there on up it was added after the Great Baltimore Fire. Unfortunately, the way that passes were handled for the burnt district after, they would favor people at Governor Warfield's insistence who wanted to do business with his particular firm, and other people were not permitted to enter at this point of the boundary of the burnt district. This grand old building behind me, constructed after the Civil War, was the Central Savings Bank of Baltimore. Today, Sir Speedy, this building survives. And actually, if you look at maps of the burnt district, you'll see one building in the northern part of the burnt district that didn't burn, on the corner of Lexington and Charles. And that's the Central Savings Bank of Baltimore, and it's with us today. You are looking east on Lexington Street at the corner of Lexington and Charles. Ironically, as you're looking at it, on the left side of the street, it did not burn. On the right side of the street, it did, with the exception of that one building that's on the corner, the Central Savings Bank of Baltimore. That building, constructed right after the Civil War, managed to survive the fire and is shown as the one lone building on the northern part that survived. At the time of the fire, H.L. Mencken was a city editor of the Baltimore Herald. Mencken would later become a famous journalist in the 20th century. The night before the fire, Mencken put the paper to bed around midnight and then proceeded on to the Stevedore Club that was located in the Yonker Hotel. He managed to have a bunch of beers with the Stevedores and then moved on to his home on Hollis Avenue. The next morning around 10 o'clock he was awakened by a man with a carriage who said, "There's a humdinger of a fire going on. Come on down to the office, we've got lots of work to do." Realizing that the fire was not moving that fast, H.L. Mencken was under the impression that it wouldn't reach the Baltimore Herald. He was wrong. While the other papers, 4 of them that were burned out, made arrangements with newspapers in Washington, D.C. to use their facilities, the Baltimore Herald was without arrangements and managed at the last minute to horn in on another Baltimore paper at the Washington Times. It didn't work out, and they came back, tried to move in with the Baltimore World, and that didn't work. Eventually, the Baltimore Herald moved on to Philadelphia. Their stay in Philadelphia was a pleasant one. However, they found that the members of the press in Philadelphia really didn't think that kindly of Baltimore newspaper men and were not that sociable. Yonkers Hotel was located where this newer building stands today. With the Yonkers Hotel, there was the Stevedores Club also, and the great drinking bouts that they would have in the evening. And so after work, H.L. Mencken would come over here around midnight and until 3 in the morning would have a grand time knocking down the beers. Also, we notice on the new building that there are 2 men that are holding up what appears to be the front portion of the building. And these poor devils are tempted by similar statues but of a different gender that are located across the street. Can you imagine these fellas holding up that building while looking across the street for decades at these lovely ladies? We're standing at the corner of Calvert and Fayette Street in downtown Baltimore. In fact, we're in Monument Square. The monument commemorates Baltimore's role in the War of 1812. At the time of the fire, the eagles behind me were glaring at the destroyed area across the street, which is now occupied by the Muncie Building. We're standing in front of City Hall at the corner of Fayette Street and Holiday. At the time of the fire, City Hall, the courthouse, and the post office was spared, but across the street was totally demolished. So the area behind me across the street was in ruins, as shown in this picture. As we look at the fire progressing through this particular area, we find that there are a good number of federal workers that are devoting their energies towards saving federal property. We're standing at the southwest corner of Fayette and Gay Street. Back in 1904, this was the location for the Church of the Messiah. Today, it is the Benton Municipal Building for the City of Baltimore. During the Great Baltimore Fire, the Church of the Messiah was the only church to burn. And did it burn right to the ground, and their beautiful church bell crashed with a tremendous thud. After the fire, the members of the congregation caused this bell to be melted down, and souvenir bells, small souvenir bells about 6 inches tall, were produced and sold. And the money realized from this sale enabled them to buy a new bell for their new church. We're standing in front of the old Gaiety Theater, built after the Great Baltimore Fire of 1904. This area to your right and left was totally destroyed. However, significant in all of this was looking further east down Baltimore Street, one building that was not destroyed. The one building in this total area at this end of the fire district was the monumental Burlesque House. Some say the devil had intervened. I don't believe that, though. Behind me is the Alex Brown Building. Constructed in 1900, it managed to survive the Great Baltimore Fire of 1904. Clearly a case of the little guy winning out against the giant across the street. I'm looking towards the site of the Continental Trust Building, a 16-story building that was the tallest in this area. It was ablaze, and the tremendous heat and fire that moved up seemed to suck all the damage and troubles away from the Alex Brown building to my rear. And indeed, that building, the Alex Brown building, survived because of the flames moving upwards from this Continental Trust building that I'm looking at here. The blaze was seen all the way from the Eastern Shore and also seen from Washington, D.C. The Alex Brown building was the heart of banking at the time. It was an old, and indeed the oldest, banking institution of its type. There was crack damage to the stonework outside, but as tight as a vacuum jug, it managed to hold up against the fire. You're looking at the old building of the Mercantile Trust and Deposit Company. Miraculously, this building managed to survive, and they were located fairly in the middle of the burnt district. Years later, on their complimentary blotters that they would hand out, they had a picture of this old building and then the fact that they survived the fire. The idea was that if you had a safe deposit box with their company, it was secure. Only minor damage, and in one case, there was a can of paint that was on the president's desk, and the heat of the fire started a small fire with the paint that was in the can. But other than that, everything else was intact. I'm standing in front of Baltimore's old fish market, and there's a plaque behind me commemorating the Great Baltimore Fire. There's one other occasion where the fire is mentioned, but that is on the other side of town, of the limits of the burnt district, and that is at the Cathedral of Mary Our Queen, located on Charles Street. It seems that Thomas O'Neill was so grateful for what he considered to be divine providence that saved his building, that he left a great deal of his money to the Catholic diocese, and in turn the Cathedral of Mary Our Queen was constructed, and the money left over built Good Samaritan Hospital. In this particular case, we're talking about the impact of electricity on command, control, and communications and transportation. Transportation at the time was conducted on horseback, in carriage, or a wagon, or on the train, or on a trolley. But with electricity knocked out, that would knock out the trolleys. And the motormen, the streetcar motormen, would stay right with their trolley cars until the electricity came back on sometime later. Their families would bring them food and water, and they stuck right with their vehicle. As the fire progressed, the telegraph operations were knocked out of commission. And so to restore telegraph operations, the telegraph company moved away from the burnt district and to a likely pole that had all the necessary fixings in order to have an adequate telegraph hookup. And that happened to be in front of the House of Welch. And in that building and up in the attic, the folks there in 1904 maintained communications with the outside world. Indeed, telegraph communications also knocked out. Gave the impression that to many that were involved in the inner workings of the fire that communications had been severed. Well, that was not the case. You would merely walk away from it all, get about 10 or 12 blocks away, and you could talk on a phone and could operate in terms of telegraph communications. So all was not lost. Things worked very well. As a matter of fact, the newspapers had it right. In other cities, when passengers would get out of the train, a train coming from Baltimore, they would be quizzed by the New York City press of the What did you notice? What did you see before you left? And sometimes some great first-story accounts were conducted in faraway cities for faraway newspapers. Back in 1904, Baltimore called the Black Basin, and for a good reason. It was all silted up, it was very shallow, it was a horrible, smelly place. At that time, Baltimore did not have anything for wastewater treatment. As a matter of fact, the wastewater from people's toilets and sinks managed to flow downhill and into the Black Basin. There was a suggestion that over at Federal Hill, horses pulling large equivalents of bulldozers today would scoop all the dirt up there and fill in that horrible smelling Black Basin. In place of this large Coast Guard vessel, there were other vessels at the time also capable of going out in the ocean, and many of them made a trip to Norfolk and other places as part of a round robin to bring people to and from Baltimore. We find that many immigrants from Europe came in this direction. 2 German ships came in at the time of the Great Baltimore Fire, and lo and behold, there were people who just didn't want to get off and wanted to go back to Germany. Can you imagine that? Many of the ships that were in the Black Basin at that time felt quite secure. There they were, out in the water, and not at all troubled with the approaching fire. But as the fire approached Pratt Street and hit the wharfs and managed to cause the turpentine to burst into flame and the tar and the resins to go up in smoke, the ship started to back up. And then finally, all at once, a little bit after midnight, they recognized that they too may be doomed. Consequently, they all pulled out at the same time, had one hell of a traffic jam, and took quite a while to get untangled. But eventually they did and moved away from the harbor. With us today is Tommy D'Alessandro, former mayor, Baltimore City. We're at the edge of the Jones Falls, and the question that I have for Mr. Mayor is, what was the role of St. Anthony and St. Leo's Church in all of this?
Well, you got to remember back in 1904, the Little Italy parish of St. Leo's consisted primarily of Italian immigrants. And the chief saint, if there's such a designation for the immigrants, was St. Anthony of Padua. And when this fire broke loose on Charles Street and started its way east, nobody or that the magnitude of the fire was such that fire departments from all over the East Coast had to come to Baltimore to help to quell it. They began to huddle in St. Leo's Church, the immigrants, and to pray to St. As the fire began to spread, it went from Charles Street Lexington Street, Lexington Charles, down to St. Paul Street, down to Calvert Street, down to here, to the Jones Falls. It's right across the street from the falls was the fire coming. Some people who didn't go into the church were gathered a little bit away from here, praying on their knees to St. Anthony. Now, all along the line, these firemen worked in concert, but the fire just overwhelmed them. There was some trouble with the connections to the fire hoses or the fire plugs or whatever. But whatever it was, they began to find a solution to it, so they decided to make this the last line of defense, right along here, along the Jones. It was firemen from every city that you can imagine on the East Coast. For some crazy reason that we call, these fire hoses worked in concert for the first time, with full force and power through them and hitting this fire head on. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, no prediction from any of the weather forecasters, the wind shifted. Here's the fire hoses hitting perfectly, and the wind shifted, and St. Leo's and all of East Baltimore, which at that time was populated by almost an army of immigrants, were saved. The damage that was done, while it was serious, was strictly property damage. If this thing had crossed over to Jones Falls with lumber yards over there and shanty-type towns, this thing would have spread throughout East Baltimore and would have been a tragedy. But we feel that St. Anthony stopped this. It's the miracle of St. Anthony. Nobody else can explain, where all the forecasters could not explain why the wind changed so suddenly. How come the fire hoses began to work with absolute perfection, far beyond their capacity? How do you explain that if you don't believe in faith? And that's why, I think the 13th of June, we have a Mass at St. Leo's. We celebrate to St. Anthony, his miracle. We have a small parade around the neighborhood. Later on, it was attached to a festival, St. Anthony's Festival. It's pretty popular, but we remember St. Anthony by that Mass, and we remember St. Anthony by this act of faith that prevented the spread of this fire. I don't know how anybody else can explain it.
Environmental pollution abatement was not a factor back in 1904. In fact, these waters were riddled with heavy metals caused by copper smelting not far from here. So lots has been done since that time to improve this inner harbor to the beauty that we're very proud of it and its relevance to our city, reaching back to the very beginning of Charm City.